Today we'll be looking at the journey we commenced in 2012 to introduce Lifecycle technologies to the New South Wales Department of Education, or DOE as it is commonly known. Jared and I will also be showcasing innovation and experimentation in the IoT space and how this will improve modelling outcomes. I'll also give you a glimpse of where we're heading over the next few years in the next phase of our journey. So to begin, we undertook this journey with just one purpose in mind, and that was to improve the condition of our schools for the benefit of our students. So, a little bit of technical point roll. Yeah, the link between asset condition and student learning outcomes has been confirmed. Going to start again, sorry. The link between asset condition and student learning outcomes has been confirmed by extensive international research by respected academics, such as Earthman and Edwards in the United States. They have shown that there is a difference in outcomes of up to 17% in standardised testing for students who undertake their schooling in facilities where they are in excellent condition, as opposed to those who undertake their schooling in poor condition facilities. Learning outcomes are in turn directly linked to the average lifetime earnings of students after they finish school. The work we have done over the last 9 years has shown that the cost-benefit ratio from investing in educational facilities exceeds 1. In the next couple of slides, I'd like to briefly touch on the history of condition assessments in DOE. We've been undertaking these in various forms since the mid-1990s, when a condition-based approach to maintenance superseded the previous cyclic maintenance methodology. Under the cyclic approach, maintenance was planned to be undertaken in each school on a regular basis, a 10-year cycle for individual internal elements and a 5-year cycle for external elements. This approach works pretty well provided there is sufficient funding available to support it. In DOE, however, this was not always the case. Some of our schools, particularly in the inner city, suffered badly as a result of the lack of funding. The condition-based approach was introduced to ensure that the scarce maintenance funding that was available was directed to the areas of greatest need. The assessments that we undertook in those early years provided a snapshot of the items that had reached the end of their useful life at the time of the assessment. In the beginning, they're undertaken by our contracted maintenance service providers. Later, we provided in-house training for our in-house staff to undertake them for us. There are a couple of major issues with this approach, however. Firstly, the assessments did not provide any projections of future maintenance. Secondly, those undertaking the assessments were somewhat conflicted. Maintenance contractors, as they have been contracted to do the work which they identified by the assessments, and some in-house staff tried to game the system by overinflating the maintenance needs in their respective regions to attract individual funding. So in order to overcome these issues and to meet New South Wales Treasury requirements, we decided in early 2012, with the enthusiastic backing of our then Minister, to adopt a best practice lifecycle approach to managing our assets, with condition assessments being undertaken by independent industry specialists. After an initial successful trial of around 50 schools and a tender process, we rolled out the first statewide assessments across our 2,200 schools and around 3.6 billion individual components in 2012-13. We followed this up with a round 2 assessment in 2017-18. Asset Future has been our partner throughout this whole journey. During this time, we've also added improvements, including additional asset classes and IoT pilots. There have been significant outcomes from both the funding and recognition perspective for this project. In 2016, Treasury commissioned an independent review of our system and processes and found they represented good practice. As a result, they provided additional funding in excess of $1.2 billion over the last 4 years. $622 million of this was provided in 2019-20 to completely eliminate the maintenance backlog in all our schools by the 30th of June 2020. By way of comparison, during the 1990s period mentioned previously, the average maintenance funding was about $15 million per annum. You can see that the monumental impact the system has had on our funding base. This has in turn impacted on the condition of our portfolio. Based on the facility condition index being recognised by our Treasury, our portfolio now falls within an excellent condition band. The initiatives we've undertaken in this space have also been recognised nationally. In 2019, we were a finalist in the Prime Minister's Awards for Excellence in Public Sector Management. In the same year, we were also finalists in the AMC Awards for Innovation in Perth. And our recent work on IoT innovation has been recognised by the Asset Management Council. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So I'd now like to hand over to Darren, who is a data manager for Asset Future and has been the lead on our IoT pilot. Darren will describe the work undertaken by his team and highlight some of the innovations that have come out of it. These will form the basis of future improvements to the model as part of our joint commitment to continuous improvement. Over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Brian. Having a network of smart devices is nothing new in asset management. Considering the ratio of connected devices to world population has surpassed 4 devices per person in 2020. The devices are everywhere, from monitoring foot traffic in shopping centres to an intricate network of sensors working together to optimise energy consumption in offices. Your smartphone, your smartwatch, or any other connected device in your home is an IoT device. There are a huge number of vendors out there talking about what their sensor data could be used for, but I'm here to share what we have done to apply IoT data to accelerate lifecycle delivery. So how can IoT be applied to the asset management framework? This is a relatively complex and interconnected framework as it is, and IoT shouldn't be seen as adding to the complexity, but rather a complementary data source that simplifies and accelerates the process. The key difference of IoT over most other conventional data sources in asset management is that it is an automated, always available data capture process, where typically we have assessor-based data capture for engineering reports and compliance audits. Looking at the wider asset management ecosystem, IoT data capture accelerates the feedback loop in lifecycle delivery. So in the context of DOE, going from having data updates when there are asset changes to data readings to the minute is a huge leap forward in what is possible in terms of making decisions, reviewing and iterating upon those decisions to get to the optimal solution faster, and ultimately, proactively, solve problems before they happen. The IoT pilot was started as a joint exploration project where you are not sure of the outcomes or if there would be outcomes, but without the data, you have no visibility. So let's run through what we did. We placed 26 motion sensors and 26 environmental sensors across 2 schools, starting from May 2019, which we are still collecting data from those sites today. The sensors are in a range of classrooms and learning spaces to get a good range of different spaces that students would use on a typical school day. Motion sensors detect motion, and environmental sensors detect CO2, lighting, temperature, and humidity. As students move around the classroom for various activities or enter and exit for recess and lunch, the environmental conditions are constantly changing, with the movements recorded. What we noticed over time was that the anticipated usage of certain learning spaces had a clear difference from the actual usage. So we began to model real-time utilization data and how it would impact asset degradation. I'm going to run through the equations we applied to the models used for the more technical audience members. If you would like to know more, we ran a more in-depth presentation at AMC last year, so please feel free to deep dive into the models there. Dynamic utilization factor consists of 2 parts: relative occupancy rate and relative room capacity. The first part is relative occupancy rate. This calculates the number of people occupying a room relative to the typical number of people for that area type. To paraphrase, it's looking at how each class size compares to class sizes across the state. This ratio is then multiplied by an industry weighting depending on how effectively the room can be used as the number of people in the room changes. The next part of dynamic utilization factor is relative room capacity. This looks at how much area per person is available for use compared to the recommended room capacity in accordance with the National Construction Code guidelines. So using the classroom example, this looks at how much space does each student have in a classroom compared to what is the recommended space for students in a classroom. This ratio is then multiplied by an industry weighting depending on how effectively the room can be used as each person's usable space changes. So understanding how the equation works, let's put the calculation into action. Let's run through this hypothetical example of an aluminium framed window in an Australian beachfront climate zone with a 20-year life cycle, where when the room is brand new, it was being overutilized, and as the condition deteriorated, it became underutilized. The black line shows the reference model of the window. In this example, the rate of degradation is fixed and does not change with the amount of utilization. The orange line shows the reference model with dynamic degradation applied, which factors in varying utilization rates over time. When the asset was utilized at 220%, the gradient of the degradation curve is steeper, degrading faster between the years 2 to 8. And when the asset was utilized at 50%, the gradient of the degradation curve is flatter, degrading slower from year 8 onwards. So despite the asset being very heavily used at the beginning of its life, the rate of degradation slows down with service life, eventually exceeding design life by 3 years. Understanding how the utilization rate can shift the degradation curve, let's look at the actual IoT data with the calculated utilization rate applied to the carpet floor. There are 4 classrooms, A, B, C, and D. You'll notice that there's only 4 lines instead of 5, as the purple line, the fixed degradation model, overlaps with classroom D at 100% utilization. The fixed degradation model represents our typical anticipated degradation curve. Comparing the fixed curve with the other 3 classrooms, we can see that classroom A, B, and C have less utilization, so the carpet lasts longer, with the orange line, classroom B, lasting 6 years longer, or 60% longer than anticipated. Although this may seem trivial in a sample size of 4 classrooms, if this was applied at scale, across 40,000 classrooms in 2,200 schools in New South Wales, the savings on cost, material, and labour would grow over time. Earlier, Brian spoke about the drawbacks of cyclical assessments, where assessors can potentially be conflicted. With IoT, the data collected is objective and logging every change as it happens. Building on these results, we've explored other potential project applications outside of more accurate degradation models within the asset management framework. As exciting as deriving equations and applying them to degradation models are, the most compelling application of IoT data would be to ensure primarily fit for purpose and ultimately lowest cost of ownership. Utilization data can be used to measure whether a room's layout is fit for purpose. If there is no one in a certain room, why aren't they there? Like, for example, is the classroom empty in the afternoon because students do not have any classes scheduled for that subject? Or is it because the west-facing afternoon glare makes the room a light box and the air conditioner can't keep up with the rising room temperature? Lowest cost of ownership is not only financial, i.e. less emergency repairs in the short term, and knowing whether to acquire, upgrade, or maintain certain assets in the long term. But also, most importantly, the cost of time. Attentive time. Time that teachers and students could have spent learning rather than thinking about, why can't I see the electronic whiteboard? Or what is that musky smell in the room? The relationship between attention span and time for humans is 3 to 5 minutes for every year of a child's age. So hypothetically, a 5-year-old should be able to concentrate on a task for up to 25 minutes. If the learning environment is not ideal in that time span, then it is a lost opportunity to time. I'd now like to hand you back to Brian.
Thanks, Darren. So where do we go to from here? We're currently gearing up for round 3 assessments and looking forward to continuing our innovation journey in IoT, at expanding our collection data into new asset classes. We will continue to ensure greater integration of the systems from Asset Future, DLE, and other external systems we use so that all the data is transported seamlessly and automated, so there's no input errors. We're going to continue this journey, and we continue to look forward to sharing our progress with you as we go down. So finally, I'd like to acknowledge Darren and his team and the wider team at Asset Future for all the hard work they've put in over the last 9 years. And we're now open to any questions that you might have for us. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Well, those in the audience will notice a little hand icon that's just appeared on your panel. So if you do have a question for either Brian or Darren, feel free to just click that and I'll be able to unmute you, or I'll give you a minute or so to type your questions in and I'll choose some good ones to ask on your behalf. Okay.
Not too hard, I hope.
Well, someone just raised their hand but took it down again. You can type your question in if you like and I'll ask it for you. Okay, the first one's come through from Bob Henry. Oh, they're all coming through now. Okay, first question. How are you integrating wear factors into your data stream?
Sorry, the question was integrating wear factors into the data stream?
Correct, yes.
So we it's sensor based. So the data stream comes into the warehouse and we sort of interpret it from there. Hopefully I'm interpreting the question correctly, but like the wear factors for this project in particular, we actually segregated the data that was collected for specifically school hours. So we were excluding weekends and public holidays, such that we were looking at a definitive sample of when rooms were actually used in those periods of times, to get a more representative result of what is reality.
Okay, Trevor Oyston would like to know, was this process also applied to OPEX maintenance or just CAPEX?
So there's potential application for this for primarily CAPEX is our application at the moment, but potentially it's pretty widely known that you can integrate sensors into big size plant and equipment to sort of monitor their live status, and in that you would be able to determine the OPEX requirements of equipment. So really it can be for both.
And could I just add there too, in addition to the condition assessments, we've done functionality assessments. So this data on condition combined with functionality is used to prioritise a lot of capital expenditure within the department.
Peter Robinson's asking, were there areas where OPEX or CAPEX savings could be identified in the New South Wales Schools asset portfolio?
So, Brian, did you want
to repeat the question for us?
Sure. Were there areas where OPEX or CAPEX savings could be identified in the New South Wales Schools asset portfolio?
I'll answer, Darren. Yeah, we were able to use this data to find out what the actual liability was at every school, every classroom across the state. And in that way, we weren't doing unnecessary maintenance in some classrooms. Like I said, with the old cyclic maintenance, you did it whether you needed it or not. The cycle came up, you went through, and there are horror stories of public works coming through, painting windows that were almost brand new, or painting over spider webs on the windows and so on. So with this system in place, and with it being kept up to date, which we do on an annual basis, or whenever we do maintenance, we update the system. Whenever we do capital works, we update the system. We're not spending maintenance money on things that don't need to be maintained just because there was some cycle associated with it in the past.
Okay, we had a similar question about the infrastructure spend, so I might skip that one. David Reeves, did you consider utilising classroom timetables and class number analysis in a big data lake instead of sensors?
So yes, that was a consideration. Obviously, class timetables, there's a limitation to the class timetables and class sizes as it's what you anticipate it to be, and that was what we have been using so far in terms of understanding the usage of classrooms. But this is looking at, based upon looking at from the timetables, are the rooms actually being used in accordance with what is being collected in the timetables? So it's trying to monitor usage from a unplanned sense to see actual usage.
Okay. Knight and Kundap's asking, can we possibly use this information to calculate benefit realisation? What do you think?
Where we are entering in terms of IoT is we're trying to quantify something that is qualitative. So we're trying to analyze the quality of life of the occupants or the customers or the students in this case. There should be a way of quantifying that in terms of satisfaction. I don't have a definitive answer personally as to how you would quantify the satisfaction, but by benchmarking the environmental conditions of a space relative to other spaces and coupling that with usage, you should be able to determine what is the ideal conditions of a room for occupants to be satisfied, and the satisfaction would come from, is it being used effectively or is it being used extensively throughout a day?
Okay, we'll just ask a couple of more questions before we wrap up. This one's from Bob Henry. Based on the pilot program outcomes, how do you see this developing?
I can answer that from a DOE perspective. We, as I said, we're about to hit off on round 3 assessments. This will be part of those round 3 assessments in a way in which we'll be expanding the current pilot greatly in the round 3 assessments. We'll be putting a lot more sensors in, and we'll be putting them in strategic schools around the state so that we can get a statewide view of how this all works. There is some cost associated with it, so we've got to be careful that we don't, we can't put a sensor in every classroom. There's 40,000 of them across the state, but we can get a representative sample, we think, so that we can start to modify the model based on these representative samples. Darren, I don't know whether you want to add any more.
Yeah, so it's really expanding the application of the existing projects.
Okay, perfect.
And before the environmental factors are equally important to us. And the level of CO2 in a classroom determines also the ability for children to react. So, you know, we'll be not just modifying the utilisation factors, we'll be looking at the environmental factors also.
All right, let's end on a general question from Prageeth, who would like some of your thoughts on what do you think would be the best explanation for short, medium and long-term life cycle modelling in terms of time frame? And can this be changed with the industry?
Yeah. So empirically speaking, short term is 1 to 2 years, medium term is 3 to 5, and long term is 10 plus. This application of IoT, or like in terms of dynamic utilization factor, is intending to impact upon the short term initially, and obviously because it impacts the short term, it can consequentially impact the long term. Something to keep in mind with lifecycle degradation models is that it is an iterative process. You can't just because we believe the way that we've derived the equation now doesn't mean it's sort of a be all end all. We need that feedback loop to refine and iterate upon the model to ensure that it becomes closer and closer to what it's representing in reality. I guess I can give a really quick example as inside this project itself. Like we actually explored the maximums and minimums of how much or how little a room can be used. And what we found was that there's actually a ceiling and floor as to how much extra it can be used or how little it can be used. The space will still degrade in little usage, such that we needed to apply sort of caps as to like how far does this dynamic degradation impact occur in the model. And I guess the second part of the question, can this be changed with the industry? It's an ongoing process. Like it has to do with how much adoption there is to data, how much the data is getting used, but somewhat of a personal bias here, but I believe that data is the future as to how we can apply degradation models more effectively across industry.
I think from a public sector perspective, DOE is somewhat of a lighthouse, and the information we've given into Treasury has been accepted by Treasury, and Treasury are now looking for other agencies to adopt this kind of technologies in their planning. So I think it will be a big impact on the industry.